work in the library, and I usually work at the checkout desk, but I also work on the display case. Usually for the month of March, we do a display for Women's History Month. And we are fortunate this year that the human service students were working on a project called Finish Her Story. And is trying to preserve the local history of women involved in the women's suffrage movement. In 2019, it was in August, it was the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. The 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. What we have here is, these are typical signs they had during demonstrations, during parades for women's suffrage, particularly in the 1900s after President Wilson was elected president. They had a very cold relationship with the president. Whenever World War I started, well, actually before World War I, the women's suffrage in the parades and such were kind of lukewarm, accepted by people. But when World War I started, people didn't care for their attack on the president and his not willing to have women have the right to vote. And they would often stand outside of the White House, particularly Alice Paul, who was a very famous suffragist. Her group would stand outside of the White House and demonstrate and hold signs in front of the White House. And during World War I, they actually were arrested and jailed. They were force-fed food in prison whenever they would do a hunger strike. But all that negative things that happened to them, and they were attacked by men and crowds, and they were attacked in their parades. So all this negative coverage actually gave more sympathy for their cause. And so anyway, that's why I put the signs up the way we did. Some of the local things that we have through Western Maryland Public Library, they had a site called Wilbur, and they took a lot of the newspaper articles from the local newspapers from back in the 1900s. And Cumberland was a very vibrant city, and there was a good bit going on as far as women's suffrage movement and people stopping through and visiting and speaking at programs. And one of the most popular women's right program was the Just Government League. And they actually had parades and marched through Western Maryland from Frederick. Then they would stop in Cumberland and march practically to Frostburg. And then they ended up marching in Garrett County as well. So there's some photos of the women who traveled by train and came to these different areas and did these hikes and marches to promote their cause. This is kind of time period clothing. We have the hat. We have the 19th Amendment, which reads, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." And what people don't realize, it took 72 years. It took 2 generations of women to win this fight. I've also discovered that there was a lot of women of color who have been left out of the history books, who had a very prominent role in suffrage. And I actually found an article in the Smithsonian, and it promoted quite a bit of the women of color and their contributions to the suffrage movement. And I've kind of profiled some of the women from this article, America's Second Revolution, and I can kind of flip over, but I have these women up on my display as well. Probably the most well-known woman is Ida B. Wells, and she started out having her parents die and having to raise her brothers and sisters. But she started out in Tennessee protesting against lynchings, and then she was a very prominent figure in the women's suffrage movement for black women. Some other books that have been recently published. One of these is a children's book, but it's wonderful. It has colored pages that's filled with history. And it's called Finish the Fight, and it is by Veronica Chambers and the other women's staff of the New York Times. And in this book, I love the way it starts, because it starts out saying that, let me get to the page. Starts out, here are some suffragists you may have learned about, which are like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And then it goes on to say, but there are lots more you should know. And that where it brings all the women of color, including Native Americans, Sojourner Truth, and so many others that we just don't know their stories. And we need to really get into that and learn all their stories to understand the fights and the privilege we have to vote. And then another thing I thought was interesting, the women's suffrage movement had many different articles and many different publications, but one of the most famous one is Alice Paul started, and it was called The Suffragist. And when they finally won the right to vote, they had the Statue of Liberty hugging a woman, saying "at last." And when you think about it, having the Statue of Liberty standing for freedom and having the Statue of Liberty being a woman standing for freedom, but yet the women did not have the right to vote, it was a little too ironic. And there were a lot of cartoons showing the Statue of Liberty in the women's suffrage movement, saying it's a sign of liberty, but yet the women don't have the liberties that the men have.